When a grieving widow stood at her husband's funeral on a quiet afternoon, everything seemed so ordinary. The memorial flowers were neatly arranged, hushed condolences were exchanged, and the minister's voice droned through well-worn verses. But then, a stranger leaned in. 6 words changed her world forever. "You were one of the Valentine wives." No explanation, no name, just a whisper that shattered the peace. And in that moment, the life she knew slipped away. Before we dive into this extraordinary story of secrets, loyalty, and the lengths we go to protect the truth, let us know where you're reading from and if you believe in the power of the human spirit. If you find yourself immersed in this tale, remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories. Evelyn Pierce had always thought her life was perfectly ordinary. She had loved Daniel since she was 19 years old. He was older, wiser, and a man who folded socks with what she teasingly called military precision. It struck her, from the very first weeks of their marriage, that he did everything with the calm, measured approach of someone who had once lived under strict, unwavering discipline. If he was threatened by the unpredictability of the world around him, he never showed it. Evelyn, on the other hand, was someone who thrived in spontaneity. She painted in her spare time, visited new libraries or bookstores each month, and took up random classes, pottery, line dancing, or Tai Chi, just to taste new experiences. In Daniel, she believed she'd found a soothing counterbalance to her own whimsical nature. He was still water to her sometimes swirling tides, and for most of their marriage, the dynamic had worked. They lived in an unassuming 2-story colonial on a leafy cul-de-sac in Maryland. The neat front lawn, meticulously groomed, was Daniel's pride and joy, and he mowed it diagonally because, he insisted, it looked sharper that way. He had a schedule for everything. Trash went out by 7 o'clock on Thursday mornings, and a thorough vacuuming of the house was done every Saturday at 9. Their daughter, Karen, sometimes teased him about his regimental approach to domestic life, but Evelyn simply found it reassuring. She had never questioned this part of Daniel's personality. Until the day he died, she had never considered that her dear husband might have hidden layers beyond her imagining. His passing was sudden, a heart attack that came without warning. One night he simply clutched his chest, tried to speak, and then slumped over. Evelyn had called 911, but there was nothing anyone could do by the time help arrived. After 47 years together, everything she knew changed overnight. For 2 days, she moved through a numb haze, absorbing well-meaning condolences from family members and neighbors. Karen consoled her in the quiet hush of their living room, brushing Evelyn's gray-streaked hair back from her forehead, whispering that everything would be okay, that they would get through it together. Matthew, their older child, promised to extend his time in Maryland before heading back to his job as a defense contractor. Evelyn was grateful for their presence. She was still reeling, still trying to figure out how to be in a world without Daniel. The funeral was held on a windless afternoon. The sun fell gently on the manicured cemetery grounds, and Evelyn stood by Daniel's casket, the soft hum of insects filling the silence. Karen was at her side, silently weeping. Matthew stood on Evelyn's other side, stoic, his jaw set in that determined way she recognized. He had inherited Daniel's methodical posture, though she'd never considered there might be more to it than simple temperament. Friends and acquaintances murmured their final respects, approached the casket one by one, and drifted away. Then, a man with pale eyes and thin lips stepped up. She assumed he was one of Daniel's colleagues from the State Department. Daniel had been a logistics officer, after all, and the building was full of people she had only met once or twice at holiday parties. But this man was different. She couldn't recall his face or name. He leaned in, ignoring the funeral director's cautious glance, and whispered, "You were one of the Valentine wives." The tone was almost regretful. Without giving her a chance to respond, he stepped back and walked away, vanishing amid the gravestones and black-clad mourners. Evelyn stood frozen, heart thudding in her chest. For a moment, she wondered if she had misheard him. Valentine wives? She'd never heard that phrase in her life. Why would he say something so strange? The words carried an unsettling weight, a sense that they were meant to provoke some hidden understanding in her. The rest of the funeral blurred. Karen, noticing that her mother was motionless, gently took her arm and led her to a waiting car. There was talk of returning to the house for a small gathering. Neighbors had prepared casseroles and fruit platters. Evelyn nodded, numb, and vaguely greeted guests who came by to pay respects. She accepted their sympathy, but inside, she was fixated on that bizarre phrase. Valentine wives. Was it something Daniel had known about? Was it a code, a reference to some private joke? For days she tried to shake it off. After all, she had so many tasks to finalize: insurance forms, flowers to send thank you notes for, the funeral director's final invoice. She had to plan a small reception for out-of-town relatives who had come all this way. People said it was good to be busy, to keep her mind from sinking into grief. But she found her mind drifting. In the silent spaces between tasks, that phrase returned, haunting her. One night, as she stood in the upstairs hallway, staring at old photographs, one of Daniel in his uniform, taken decades earlier, she felt a tingle of unease along her spine. She couldn't place where exactly the disquiet was coming from, only that there was something essential about her husband she had never understood. 2 weeks after the funeral, just as she was beginning to think maybe she should let it go, a package arrived in the mail without a return address. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, the corners taped meticulously. Curious, she brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table. No markings or notes on the outside. The kids had already departed. Matthew back to his life, Karen returning to her own job and family. Evelyn wondered if it could be from an old friend of Daniel's. Perhaps it was a condolence gift sent late. Inside, she found a single small envelope. On it, in Daniel's neat handwriting, was an instruction. Locker 14B, Arlington Archives. For your eyes only. Delivered per D. Pierce. That crisp note felt like Daniel speaking to her from the grave. A final piece of an unfinished puzzle. She almost tossed the entire package into the trash, overwhelmed at the oddness. But she knew Daniel well enough to understand that if he took the trouble to plan this, it mattered. Even now, the thought of ignoring it filled her with a stab of guilt. That night she barely slept. The envelope sat on her nightstand, glinting in faint moonlight. The next morning, she drove to Arlington. She located the old archives building, a structure with tall columns and a somewhat imposing presence. The interior smelled faintly of must and paper. A bored receptionist pointed her in the direction of the locker bays in the lower corridor. She found locker 14B easily enough, turned the key she had discovered tucked under the envelope's flap, and opened the metal door. Inside was a single box, not too large but surprisingly heavy. She carried it to an empty table along the wall. The overhead fluorescent light buzzed softly. When she opened the box, she saw a sealed folder, its corners battered, labeled Langley, 1974. Beneath it was a photograph of Daniel in uniform, standing next to a woman Evelyn didn't recognize. There was something intense in Daniel's eyes, an energy she had rarely seen in him in their quiet suburban life. Her pulse quickened. She felt as if she'd invaded someone else's secret. Carefully, she lifted the folder. A larger label read Project Valentine. Operational records, stamped in thick black lettering. Red ink across the front read Pierce, Evelyn M. Status: Decoy asset active profile. Unaware. She stared, her mind resisting the words. Felt surreal, like reading an outlandish conspiracy theory. Her name? What did they mean? Status: Decoy asset active. She thought of the cryptic phrase at the funeral. Valentine wives. Hands trembling, she opened the folder. Pages of official memos, intelligence documents, and psychological profiles poured out. She recognized her own details. Her place of birth, the church she attended, random pieces of her college psychology essays, references to a bookstore she frequented. Every piece of her life was meticulously documented. She scanned the lines, seeing suggestions about subjects' loyalty retention and recommend romantic bonding protocol within 90 days. Everything was so clinically stated, as though describing a test subject, not a human being. Her legs turned to jelly. She sank into the chair, reeling. She read phrases about the Cold War, about Daniel's extraction from Prague in 1973. The words blurred together in her mind. Deep cover, compromised, new identity, CIA domestic operation designed to stabilize extracted operatives. She was used as a leash. She tried to digest the revelations, but it was too massive, too shocking. The folder ended with notes referencing Phase 2, child monitoring. The date on that note was years after Matthew's birth. She left the archives in a daze, her breath shallow. She drove home without remembering the trip, the box on the seat beside her. She went inside, locked the door behind her, then sank onto the living room couch. She reread certain pages, numb and uncomprehending. She read until her eyes burned with fatigue, then started again, searching for any explanation that made sense. The documents described a program called Project Valentine, an initiative from the CIA's earlier decades, designed to reintegrate compromised agents into everyday American life through carefully orchestrated marriages. The wives, handpicked for their empathy traits and loyalty responses, were never told. The rationale was that a stable home life, anchored by a spouse who would unwaveringly support a husband's emotional or psychological needs, could ensure an operative wouldn't unravel or turn rogue. Evelyn found references to the name Pierce. Daniel had been assigned a new identity after his Prague mission. He had once been Daniel Novak, a deep-cover operative who had infiltrated certain Eastern European circles. She couldn't wrap her mind around it. Every memory she had, meeting him for the first time on campus, falling in love, building a life, started to feel manipulated, planned in some boardroom by men in suits. As shock turned to anger, she ripped a page from the file and flung it aside. She almost wanted to burn the entire box, to rid herself of the horrifying intrusion into her life. But she needed answers. She called Matthew. Her son had always been practical and measured. He worked as a defense contractor, though his exact duties were often vague. She assumed it was something with technology or intelligence, given how reticent he was about details. When he arrived later that night, she spread the documents on the kitchen table. He studied them carefully, not saying a word for a long time. He'd always been a deliberate reader, absorbing each line with thorough scrutiny. Finally, he straightened up. "Mom," he said gently, "this is real. It's obviously old CIA documentation. A lot of it is referencing forms we still occasionally see in certain classified programs. But," he hesitated, looking pained, "if you read all of it, you're going to lose the version of Dad you've known. You're going to see things that maybe you'd rather not see." But she had to see. Once she had glimpsed the surface of the deception, she couldn't pretend it wasn't there. She read every page in the folder again, late into the night, while Matthew scanned and organized them. A part of her wanted to hate Daniel. How dare he, for nearly 5 decades, keep this from her? Another part of her remembered him as the man who quietly kissed her forehead when she was sick, who fixed the furnace in the middle of one bitter winter, who insisted they adopt an old shelter dog named Rusty because Evelyn felt lonely when the kids moved out. The documents told a story of manipulation, of control. But her memories insisted there was genuine love there, too. Still, the more she read, the more she realized the weight of the deception. The psychological evaluations on her were horrifying to see in black and white. Her preference for comforting others was described as a reliable empathy response to perceived trauma. Her devotion to faith and community events was labeled high loyalty retention. She had been singled out, tested, shaped. The program documents indicated that after initial contact, an operative was expected to court the assigned spouse within a specified time frame. The couples would then transition into normal life, with the wife unaware she had been engineered to become the operative's emotional safety net. Shaking, Evelyn closed the folder. It felt as though the foundation of her existence had been quietly gutted by these clandestine puppet masters. Matthew stayed for 3 nights. They pored through the files, making sense of cryptic references. Names of other wives appeared in old rosters. Code words. Handlers. Doctors. Many pages were heavily redacted, black stripes removing names or entire paragraphs. Still, the recurring references to Valentine wives were clear enough. Valentine, it seemed, was the overarching code name for the entire project. They read about Phase 2, which apparently involved the children of these pairings. The official logic was that children raised in these stable yet artificially designed households could be prime candidates for future intelligence programs. That notion chilled Evelyn to the bone. She realized that it might explain certain oddities in Matthew's upbringing: his stellar test scores, the specialized tutoring he received, the unusual summer camps he attended that had more structure than typical children's programs. Had that all been part of this twisted plan? Initially, Matthew tried to reassure her that maybe it was just random happenstance. But the documents spelled it out in excruciating detail. They had monitored Matthew from infancy, evaluating his emotional and intellectual development. Evelyn recalled a faint memory of once being visited by a researcher who claimed to be from a community child wellness project. She never questioned it because it looked official enough. Now, in the retrospective glow of the truth, she realized how naive she had been. They decided to request Daniel's service records officially. Maybe that would shed more light. But every request came back with heavy redactions. They filed multiple Freedom of Information Act requests, only to receive vague notifications that their inquiries needed more time to be processed. The language was bureaucratic and unhelpful. Weeks passed in a haze of frustration. Evelyn found herself feeling more isolated than ever. Friends called to check on her, offering condolences or invitations to lunch. She tried to act normal, to be a grieving widow who was learning to get by day to day. But inside, a maelstrom of questions rattled her. She began to jump at unexpected knocks on the door, certain that some faceless agency was watching her. Her home, once a place of comfort, felt like an exhibit in a museum, carefully curated by forces she now despised. Karen didn't know the details yet. She had left after the funeral, going back to her own out-of-state life. Evelyn felt protective of her daughter, uncertain whether to share everything. But Matthew insisted that if this was real, if it involved him and, by extension, Karen, then the entire family needed to be informed. Yet he deferred to his mother's judgment, sensing how fragile she felt. The only reason Matthew himself knew so much was that she needed his help decoding the official jargon. He was her anchor in a storm, ironically echoing the role Daniel once played. She hated the sense that she was keeping secrets from her own daughter, but how could she possibly explain this in a phone call? Then came the lead she needed. She learned, through a contact of Matthew's, about a retired CIA analyst named Ruth Zimmerman, who had once worked in the Cold War Psychological Profiling Division. Matthew only had a vague connection to her. She was rumored to be living somewhere in the D.C. area. After a few discreet calls, they found her address. She was in her 80s now, living alone. It took some coaxing and references, but Matthew managed to arrange a brief meeting at a quiet park bench near the reflecting pool in the heart of Washington. Evelyn arrived early, her heart hammering. She spotted Ruth as she approached, a petite woman with white hair pinned back in a bun, wearing a neat jacket and skirt. Ruth walked with a cane, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that belied her age. Evelyn sat beside her, uncertain where to begin. Ruth regarded her with a calm, assessing gaze, as though she knew exactly why Evelyn had reached out. Evelyn started with general statements. She'd lost her husband, discovered some old documents, recognized references to a Project Valentine. Ruth listened, expression impassive, occasionally nodding. Then, as if deciding time was too precious for pretense, Evelyn spoke the words plainly. I found out that I was part of it. The files call me a decoy asset. My husband was an operative. We were married for nearly 50 years, and I only just discovered it was orchestrated from the start. Ruth sighed heavily, her voice quiet. I suspected that was why you wanted to meet, she said. A few of us in the old days called it the velvet cage. Her gaze flickered with regret. I was just a junior analyst at the time. We were told it was for national security, that these men had given everything for their country. Their psychological states were precarious. The agency believed an unwitting spouse, carefully selected, would provide a stable environment, one grounded in real emotional support, because the wife didn't realize she was part of a program. In theory, genuine love was the best anchor for a broken operative. Evelyn swallowed hard, feeling a cold knot in her stomach. Did any of them actually love their wives? Her voice trembled, betraying how desperately she needed some kernel of reassurance. That everything she shared with Daniel wasn't just an elaborate ruse. Ruth paused, looking away. They didn't manufacture love, but they exploited it. They used the wives as unwitting therapy, if you want to call it that. The men were often traumatized by deep-cover operations. A normal life, anchored by someone who genuinely cared for them, could rehumanize them. But it was all built on a lie. "I'm sorry." The words left Evelyn raw. She thanked Ruth, tears burning the corners of her eyes, though she refused to let them fall in that public space. Ruth mentioned the time constraints. She had a doctor's appointment, but she gave Evelyn her number, saying she'd be willing to answer more questions if memory allowed. Evelyn left the bench feeling as if she were carrying a leaden weight. She had to know more. How far did this go? Had Daniel known about Phase 2 with Matthew? And if so, did he try to stop it? That evening, back at her home, she paced restlessly. She checked the box from the archives again, flipping through the documents, scouring them for references to her children. There were lines about child aptitude screenings, notes on educational placements, mention of potential advanced clearance pathways. She felt sick. Her mind drifted to every milestone in Matthew's life. His success in advanced math, the hush-hush offers he received for scholarships. She had once been proud of his brilliance, chalking it up to a gift from God or natural family smarts. Now, she questioned whether the agency had been quietly steering him down that path. A small envelope slipped free from beneath the box's lining, fluttering to the floor. The handwriting on the front was undeniably Daniel's. She opened it with shaking fingers, expecting one more chilling official note. But instead, it was a letter, personal, intimate. In that letter, Daniel admitted everything. "You were never meant to be part of this. I was supposed to walk away. But you were warm, steady, familiar. I stayed. At first because it was easy, then because it was home." She read it again, tears streaking her face. He claimed he had never faked what truly mattered. He apologized for lying, for not walking away to spare her involvement. The final part of the letter revealed the worst secret. Matthew had been monitored from birth. Daniel found out too late, and by then, he was too enmeshed in the system. The guilt ate at him, he wrote, but he was tired, and they were always watching. He ended the letter, "I'm sorry." In the days that followed, Evelyn felt her anger burn anew. It was directed at Daniel, at the agency, at an entire apparatus that had stolen her reality. She also felt heartbreak for him. His letter read like a confession. He too had been trapped. She showed the letter to Matthew, who read it with clenched jaw. He was calm, but the tendons of his neck stood out, revealing the tension in his body. "I still love Dad," he said quietly, "but I can't pretend this doesn't change everything." Evelyn decided she couldn't hide this from Karen any longer. She called her daughter and asked if she could visit. Karen arrived the next weekend, setting her purse down in the foyer with a worried look. Evelyn led her to the dining table, spread out the documents, and walked her through the revelations. Karen reacted with disbelief and outrage. She demanded to see the original folder, flipping page after page. Her tears finally came as she realized the scale of the deception. "I always thought Dad was just a routine government worker, that he was just quiet," she said, voice cracking. "All this time, we were living with a stranger?" Matthew tried to explain the bigger context, but Karen found it too overwhelming. She stormed upstairs, tearful, retreating to her childhood bedroom. Evelyn let her go, understanding that her daughter needed space. That night, Karen lay awake, flipping through the photos and reading the psychological notes on her mother. Evelyn could hear her soft sobs drifting through the closed door. The next morning, Karen asked Evelyn, "Mom, what do we do now? Are we in danger? Are these people watching us? It's all so insane." Evelyn admitted she didn't know, but she resolved to find out. Deep in her gut, she sensed that Daniel had left her enough breadcrumbs to finish unraveling the truth. She couldn't let it lie. She and Matthew began a more organized search for clues. If there was a phase 2 and Daniel had tried to bury that information, maybe the program was still active in some form. Maybe others like her were still out there, or new wives were being drafted into an updated iteration. They discovered references to a particular colonel from the 1970s era named Robert Kincaid, who was mentioned in an internal memo about Valentine Direct Oversight. Kincaid was listed as a point of contact. After some modern research, they learned that Kincaid eventually retired from government service to become a private security consultant. Evelyn found an address for an old Kincaid family property in Virginia, deep in farmland. She also realized that if Kincaid was still living, he would be in his 70s or 80s by now. She reached out to her network, but most of her friends had no connections to that level of intelligence or security circles. Matthew, with his defense contractor experience, put out quiet feelers. He discovered that Kincaid was rumored to still appear at certain defense seminars, though he maintained a low profile. The more they dug, the more it seemed like a risk. Evelyn's calls to people who might know something were not always welcomed. She received a string of cryptic voicemails telling her to let sleeping dogs lie. One caller, a woman's voice, simply said, "You won't like what you find. Let him rest." Then the line disconnected. Evelyn's fear grew, but so did her determination. She wondered if any other Valentine wives had discovered the truth. She found references to a few other women named in the old rosters, a Margaret Hamilton, a Linda Carlson. But many leads were cold, or the women had passed away. She tried searching obituaries, using the name Valentine, but it yielded nothing conclusive. Just when she felt she was making no progress, she got a call from Ruth. "I found some old notes," the elderly woman said. "They're not official documents, but I wrote things down back then. Habits, observations. If you want to read them, I can let you. I have to warn you, they might not make comfortable reading." Evelyn swallowed and said yes. They arranged to meet at Ruth's small apartment the next day. Evelyn went alone, feeling strangely nervous. The building smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. Ruth welcomed her inside, leading her to a cramped living room lined with bookshelves. The woman had a determined set to her jaw, as if bracing for a moral reckoning. She handed Evelyn a weathered notebook. Inside were personal annotations from the 1970s. Some were about the extracted agents, describing how they had faced mental breakdowns after double lives overseas. Some were about the wife selection. Ruth had scribbled about guilt, about how a few analysts had questioned the ethics of manipulating unsuspecting women to become caregivers. But the higher UPS insisted it was for national security. Ruth stepped away to brew some tea, leaving Evelyn to read. The notebook described a pitched internal debate. Some felt that the wives deserved to know, but that idea was dismissed. The only real question had been how to secure the agents if they started to suspect their new suburban routine was just another mission. That was where the wives came in, with their unshakable loyalty, carefully profiled. Ruth had noted that some wives developed legitimate, deep love for their husbands. The hope was that the men would settle into normalcy. Ruth wrote about her disquiet, her sense that they were turning heartfelt marriages into manipulative therapy. But she had done nothing, she admitted. She was too junior, too afraid to speak out. Evelyn closed the notebook, tears in her eyes. "Do you know anything about Phase 2? She asked softly. Ruth nodded. The notion was that if the children of these operatives showed certain traits, they could be groomed for intelligence. The agency invests in generational assets, so to speak. It's not an official policy now, but these things have a way of continuing in smaller circles. If your son was identified as exceptional, they might have nudged him into roles that benefited the agency." Evelyn felt sick. "He's worked for defense contractors for years. He's always had a knack for that kind of work. I'm terrified that all of it, the scholarships, the job offers, was engineered." Ruth's voice was sympathetic. "It might have been, but that doesn't mean your son isn't talented. It just means they were watching, guiding. The final decisions might still have been his." A surge of anger and sadness coursed through Evelyn. "I just want to know if Daniel really loved me. If all these years, it's just heartbreaking." Ruth reached out and clasped her hand. "The wives I met were good people. The men, too, were often traumatized. Many of them did love their wives, but it was love discovered under false pretenses. That's the tragedy. Evelyn thanked her and left, uncertain if she felt any better. The clarity made it worse in some ways. She decided, though, that she would keep going, push further for answers, if only to protect Matthew from any further intrusion by these hidden watchers. She spoke to Matthew, who agreed they needed to talk to Kincaid in person. He was the only lead who might have direct knowledge. They discovered that Kincaid would be attending a small private symposium at a lodge in upstate Virginia the following week, an event focusing on historical intelligence operations. The location was a remote retreat center near a wooded lake, attended by older veterans of the intelligence community. Evelyn insisted she go. Matthew tried to dissuade her, but she refused to relent. "I want to look this man in the eye," she said. "He was there. He might have authorized my marriage." Matthew relented, deciding he'd accompany her. They booked a modest room at the nearby motel and planned to attend as casual visitors, hoping Kincaid wouldn't run if he recognized them. The drive up was tense. Evelyn stared at the passing landscape, lost in her own swirling thoughts. The retreat center was a sprawling place with log cabins, a conference hall, and a handful of scattered outbuildings. The hush of the trees lent a solemn tone to the environment. Attendees milled about, older men and women wearing name tags, sipping coffee near the registration desk. Evelyn's hands trembled as she signed the guest log with a made-up excuse about being interested in Cold War history. She spotted an elderly man with a rigid posture, wearing an old Army service ring. The name on his tag read, Robert Kincaid. She approached carefully, with Matthew at her side. "Mr. Kincaid?" she said softly. The man turned. He had piercing blue eyes, a hint of military bearing in the set of his shoulders. "We need to speak with you. It's about Project Valentine." He froze. For a moment, his face registered a flicker of shock. Then he composed himself. He checked the milling crowd, then gave a terse nod. "Outside. 10 minutes." Then he walked away. Evelyn's heart pounded. She waited the 10 minutes, which felt like an eternity. Finally, she and Matthew stepped out to a secluded clearing near the main lodge. Kincaid was there, hands clasped behind his back. He eyed them with suspicion. "Who are you?" "My name is Evelyn Pierce. I was assigned to Daniel Pierce, once Daniel Novak. I know about Valentine." The name Novak made him tense. "Why are you here?" Evelyn swallowed. "I discovered the truth after my husband died. I want to know the full story. I want to know if Phase 2 is still active. I want to know if you had anything to do with monitoring my child." Kincaid exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Mrs. Pierce, that operation was a product of a different time. We were at war. A Cold War that sometimes required extraordinary measures. I had orders, as did we all." Matthew stepped forward. "Orders to manipulate people's entire lives?" Kincaid studied him. "You must be the son." "Matthew," he replied stonily. Kincaid looked down for a moment, as if considering his words. "Your father was a compromised agent in Eastern Europe. He was too important to simply discard. Valentine was meant to ensure men like him remained loyal and stable after they returned. Yes, we profiled certain women. Yes, you ended up with a father living a lie. But it wasn't personal. It was a national strategy." Evelyn's voice shook. "It was personal to me. You took my life, my choices. I never consented to any of this." Tears threatened to spill, but she kept them at bay. Kincaid nodded curtly. "I understand. Truly I do. If you came for an apology, well, I'm sorry. But we believed we were defending the country. As for Phase 2, the concept was to harness the children's potential, given their unique backgrounds. To my knowledge, the official program shuttered decades ago. But these things don't simply vanish. They transform, go underground, migrate to black budgets or smaller compartments. I can't speak to that. I retired a long time ago." He watched them warily, as though expecting a sudden confrontation. Evelyn felt anger simmer. "So, there's no redress? No way for me to fix what happened?" To find out if they're still watching my son. Kincaid's eyes flickered. What do you want me to say? It's done. If you dig too deep, you might provoke the old guard or stir up trouble for yourself. Certain powerful figures prefer that Valentine remain a ghost of the past. If you keep pushing, they'll protect their secrets. Matthew squared his shoulders. You're basically threatening us. Kincaid shook his head slightly. A warning, not a threat. The men who oversaw Valentine believed in total secrecy. They might not appreciate you shining a light on it now. Evelyn glared at him. You owe me more than a warning. She reached into her purse, withdrew a folded page from the project file. Do you recognize this memo? It has your signature. He glanced at the paper, lips thinning. Yes, it was a standard protocol. We had to ensure stable domestic assimilation. She wanted to scream, to lash out at the man who had orchestrated so much deception. But she forced herself to remain calm. You turned my life into a mission. You robbed me of informed choice. Kincaid nodded again, acknowledging the truth. Then he gently placed a hand on her shoulder, though the gesture felt hollow. Mrs. Pierce, if it's any consolation, none of us expected such longevity. Many of these arranged marriages ended quickly, or the agent left after a few years. Your husband stayed. That means something. Evelyn felt her throat tighten at those words, thinking of Daniel's letter. He had stayed for her in spite of everything. She blinked back tears. If you have any humanity left, you'll give us something. Some name or record or contact who can confirm that phase 2 is over. That they're not going to manipulate my son again. Kincaid hesitated. Then he fished in his pocket for a small notepad, scribbled an address, and handed it over. This is a facility in West Virginia. Old training site. It changed hands a few times. I heard a rumor that part of Valentine's remnants might have ended up there. But be careful. You have no idea how protective certain folks can be of that place. Without another word, he walked away. Evelyn and Matthew stood there, stunned. 1,000 questions spun in Evelyn's mind. Her sense of moral outrage warred with exhaustion. She and her son left the symposium, skipping the rest of the event. They returned to their motel, uncertain if they should drive straight to West Virginia or if that was too dangerous. Ultimately, they decided they needed more intel before approaching an old training site with unknown watchers. They drove home, the weight of Kincaid's warning heavy in the car. Back in her house, Evelyn tried to sleep but found no rest. She kept seeing the phrase Valentine wives flickering behind her eyelids. She felt an intense need to bring closure to this ordeal. She didn't want to chase after clandestine bunkers. She simply wanted to know if her family's privacy would be safe. She wanted to ensure that no one would ever exploit her or her children again. But she also felt a haunting sense that if she didn't stand up for herself now, she never would. Over the next days, she called Ruth again, quietly explaining what Kincaid had told her. Ruth sounded anxious, warning her to tread carefully. Even if the official project ended, the old woman said, there might be rogue elements who feel they're still doing their patriotic duty. They could view you as a liability. Please watch your back. Matthew, meanwhile, tapped a few resources to see if that West Virginia facility was still active. He learned from a contact that it was rumored to be a private paramilitary training site now. The perfect location to hide any leftover records or old operational frameworks. The more he discovered, the more ominous it sounded. Karen called frequently, anxious about what was going on, but still reeling from the emotional blow. She didn't want to join any infiltration or investigation. She admitted she wasn't as methodical as her brother, nor did she feel driven by the same compulsion as her mother. Evelyn assured her it was fine, that she could remain on the sidelines. Karen sounded relieved. At last, Evelyn decided she had to see it through. She felt no sense of closure otherwise. She told Matthew she wanted to go to the West Virginia site, at least to see if there were any signs of Valentine records. I need to lay this to rest, she whispered. Matthew agreed to go with her. She asked him not to bring any weapons. She wasn't ready for a confrontation. She simply hoped to slip in, look around, and slip out if possible. But part of her knew this was naive. People who guarded secrets like these wouldn't be kind to intruders. They drove out at dawn, following the winding roads into the mountains. The countryside was austere, with stretches of forest broken by meadows. Eventually, the roads turned to gravel. Matthew's phone GPS flickered in and out. By midday, they arrived at the coordinates Kincaid had scribbled. The place looked unremarkable from the outside. A rusted chain-link gate, an old sign half fallen off that might have once said, "State Testing Site." The gate was unlocked. Matthew glanced at his mother, worried. "Are you sure, Mom?" She nodded, heart pounding. "We'll just see if there's anything here. If it's deserted, we look around. If not, we leave immediately." They proceeded up a narrow dirt road. Trees closed in on either side, branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight. Eventually, they came to a set of old structures, possibly bunkhouses or offices. A chain blocked further vehicle access. They parked and approached on foot. Everything appeared silent, but it was the kind of silence that felt staged, like there could be watchers hidden behind tinted windows. Matthew suggested they circle around to see if there was a rear entry. Evelyn's entire body was tense. She was reminded of old spy movies, except this was her reality now. The buildings were locked, windows boarded. They found a side entrance to what might have been an administrative office. A heavy padlock secured the door, but Matthew, resourceful as ever, produced a small tool kit from his bag. He managed to manipulate the lock until it gave way. The interior was dark and musty. A faint smell of old paint lingered in the air. Their flashlights cut narrow beams across cracked flooring. The main hallway led to several doors, each labeled with peeling letters. Storage, archives, mess, offices, archives. Evelyn's pulse thudded. She tried the door. Locked. Matthew jimmied it. The lock was rusted, and with a bit of effort, it clicked open. They pushed inside. Rows of file cabinets lined the walls, some drawers half open, others jammed shut. Dust coated every surface. It looked as though no one had been in here for years. They began rifling through drawers, scanning for anything referencing Valentine. They found old safety manuals, random training schedules, but no direct mention of the project. Evelyn was about to give up when Matthew pried open a locked cabinet in the corner. Inside were several battered boxes. One was labeled with a date from the 1980s. On top, scrawled in black marker, was V Phase 2 Supply. Evelyn's breath caught. She carefully pulled the box out, setting it on a nearby desk. Inside, they found sheaves of old memos, typed forms, transcripts. Many were water-damaged or partially eaten by rodents. But scattered among the pages, Evelyn recognized references to Valentine Next Generation. She saw a list of code names. Next to them were real names in parentheses, some children's names, their birth dates. She spotted Matthew's name. Next to it, a note about possible linguistic aptitude. There was a mention of potential recruitment for advanced analysis. Evelyn's eyes blurred with tears as she realized just how thorough the surveillance had been, how it had tracked him from infancy through his teenage years. They were so intent on the documents that they didn't notice the footsteps until they were almost at the door. Matthew froze. Evelyn turned off her flashlight. A beam of light bobbed in the corridor, accompanied by muffled voices. They could hear footsteps drawing closer. Evelyn's heart hammered. She and Matthew exchanged looks. They were cornered. The only exit was through that same door. She crouched, tucking the box behind a dusty cabinet. Matthew gestured for her to hide. The door swung open, and a flashlight's glare cut across the room. Evelyn held her breath, pressing against the wall behind a file cabinet. She glimpsed two silhouettes. One spoke in a gruff whisper. "I told you I heard something. Must have been in the old archives." The other man moved deeper into the room, shining the flashlight around. Dust swirled in the beam. Matthew, huddled behind a metal shelf, tried to remain perfectly still, though every nerve in his body screamed for him to do something. Evelyn clutched the edge of the cabinet, feeling the scratch of rust under her fingertips. She hoped these intruders wouldn't try to flip on the overhead lights. She tried to calm her pounding heart, afraid even the sound of her breathing might give them away. One of the men walked perilously close, peering at the old file drawers. "It doesn't look like anyone's been here in ages," he muttered. But there was a note of doubt in his voice. His partner grunted. "Still check thoroughly. If someone's sniffing around old Valentine junk, we have orders to handle it." Evelyn's blood ran cold. They were prepared to handle intruders. Clearly, Kincaid's warning had been accurate. She tried to angle herself so she could see her son. Matthew was inches from the other man's foot. She was terrified that any movement would lead to immediate detection. A minute passed, feeling like an eternity, as the men poked around. One rummaged through a half-open drawer, flipping the files. The other paced along the back wall. Finally, the second man sighed. "We'll keep an eye out. Maybe it was just some raccoon or something. Let's lock the place up better. We can't leave it wide open." They shone the flashlight one more time around the room, then retreated to the hallway. Evelyn and Matthew heard their footsteps echo, followed by the distant clink of the outside chain. They stayed frozen for what felt like 10 more minutes, neither daring to move. Eventually, Matthew risked a look. The corridor was dark again. They emerged cautiously, listening. No sign of the men. Evelyn exhaled, nearly collapsing from relief. "We need to get out of here," she whispered. Matthew nodded. She quickly lifted the battered box labeled V, Phase 2 supply, determined to take it with them. Carefully, they moved back down the corridor. They reached the side entrance, heart pounding, half expecting the men to be waiting outside. But the coast was clear. They slipped out, replaced the padlock to make it look undisturbed, and hurried to their car. Driving away, they felt the weight of that near miss. They had tangible evidence in the trunk, but the men who patrolled that site would soon realize documents were gone. Breathless, they pulled onto the main road. Evelyn's mind spun. She felt a strange mixture of triumph and dread. They had the proof, but they had also triggered alarm bells with whoever was still protecting Valentine's legacy. She glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting a black SUV to appear. None did, but she couldn't shake the feeling they'd just stepped across a line of no return. Back home, they spread the new documents on the dining table, next to the old ones. Many were too damaged or incomplete to read. But from what they could piece together, it was clear that Phase 2 involved evaluating and, in some cases, covertly guiding children toward intelligence or defense roles. Evelyn saw references to psychological testing, academic sponsorship, even targeted extracurricular activities. She recognized some parallels with Matthew's own youth, and it made her stomach churn. She read about other children identified only by code names and a few last-name references. Some of them had apparently been steered into the military, some into private sector research, others into diplomatic roles. The entire notion was deeply disturbing. She felt like her family had been puppets on invisible strings. Over the following days, the tension within the Pierce home rose to a fever pitch. Matthew stayed, determined to see this through. Karen came by, anxious about the break-in. She asked if they were in danger. Evelyn, for the first time, felt a genuine sense of fear. What if these men decided to silence them? The documents, if made public, could implicate powerful people. Matthew insisted that the best protection might be exposure. If something happened to them, it would only draw more scrutiny. They talked about going to certain reporters, but the risk of legal trouble or defamation suits was immense. And who would even believe such a far-fetched story without thorough proof? One evening, while Matthew was out picking up groceries, Evelyn paced the living room. She recalled Daniel's letter. "I tried to stop it, but I was just tired." It broke her heart. She felt a pang of sympathy for him. A man who had been forcibly shaped into a role, living with the guilt of lying to someone he genuinely cared for. She wandered upstairs to the bedroom they had shared, pausing by the closet. There, on the top shelf, was a shoebox containing keepsakes. She pulled it down, rummaging through old letters and photographs. She found little notes Daniel had written her over the years, some for birthdays, some random expressions of affection. He had always been a man of few words, but these scribbles showed glimpses of warmth, quiet devotion. She realized, with overwhelming clarity, that the love he expressed, in whatever measure he could offer, was real. Even if it began as an assignment, something genuine had grown. That knowledge was as painful as it was comforting. She sank onto the bed, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. She felt closer to Daniel in that moment than she had at the funeral. Perhaps that was how she could move forward, by acknowledging the lie but also acknowledging that real love had taken root, in spite of it all. Suddenly, her phone vibrated. A blocked number. She let it ring once, then answered. There was silence on the line. She was about to hang up when a low male voice whispered, "We know what you took. Stop now, or you'll lose more than your illusions." The line went dead. Her blood turned to ice. She scrambled to call Matthew, but he didn't answer immediately. When he finally called back, she told him about the threat. He arrived home, groceries forgotten, and began checking the locks on the doors. "Maybe we should leave," he suggested. But Evelyn refused. "I won't be driven from my own home." They considered contacting the authorities, but who would they trust? They were dealing with an entity that might have ties to old intelligence networks. For the next few days, they lived on edge, scanning the streets for suspicious cars. Evelyn barely slept, jumping at every creak. She took solace only in the fact that Matthew was with her, determined to protect her. Then, unexpectedly, a letter arrived in the mailbox, typed with no return address. It said, "We realize your determination. If you must expose this, you will face legal ramifications. The documents you possess were obtained illegally, but perhaps we can find a resolution. Consider your family's future." It was signed with a single letter, M. Evelyn stared at it, chills radiating through her. She shared it with Matthew. He frowned. "They're trying to spook us. Or maybe it's someone else in the agency who wants to orchestrate a controlled solution." Another day passed, tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then a second phone call came, this time from a woman. "Mrs. Pierce, you've proven resourceful. We're prepared to meet." She gave a location, a small diner off a country highway an hour away. "Bring everything you have. We'll discuss terms." Evelyn felt a surge of both trepidation and indignation. Discuss terms? Did these people think they were in a position to negotiate? She weighed the options. If she went, she might be walking into a trap. But if she refused, the threats might escalate. She and Matthew decided to go together, to see what they could glean from this person. They left Karen out of it, hoping to shield her from any potential danger. They arrived at the diner at dusk. It was nearly empty. Only a couple of truck drivers hunched over coffee in a corner booth. A lone waitress hovered behind the counter. Evelyn and Matthew took a booth near the back, waiting. A tall woman in a dark suit walked in, scanning the interior. She spotted them, approached, and slid into the seat across from them without introducing herself. She was perhaps in her 40s, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, exuding an air of controlled authority. "My name is unimportant," she said, voice low. "You're in possession of sensitive materials. We want them." Evelyn glanced at Matthew, who took a breath. "And if we refuse?" The woman's expression was flat. "I'd advise against that. My employers prefer that we avoid unpleasantness. But if forced, we will do whatever is necessary to secure those documents. We're prepared to offer you an assurance that any monitoring of your family ends here. A full disengagement. In exchange, you hand over the files and cease your inquiries." Evelyn bristled. "Why should we trust you? Your people have lied, manipulated, threatened us." The woman nodded curtly. "True. However, consider your position. You can't go to the press without facing immediate legal consequences for how you acquired classified material. And if you tried, you'd face more than just a lawsuit. You'd be stepping on the toes of individuals who have the resources to bury you in litigation and other forms of pressure. But you also pose a risk if something were to happen to you. You've probably made sure that if you vanish, the documents go public, correct?" Evelyn realized that this woman understood their insurance plan. Matthew had indeed scanned the files and stored them online. He'd set up an automated release if something happened to them. The woman's gaze flicked to Matthew. "We're at an impasse. Our solution is a quiet settlement. You turn over the physical evidence and delete the digital copies. We end all Valentine surveillance of your family. You live your life free from any further entanglement. It's the best offer you'll get. Evelyn felt an internal war. Part of her wanted to see the entire system exposed, to reveal the monstrous betrayal inflicted on innocent spouses. But she also recognized the personal cost. She and her children might never know peace if they took on an entrenched intelligence machine. And Daniel's memory, she wasn't sure she wanted to drag him posthumously through a public scandal. Karen's life, Matthew's job, they could be upended. She glanced at her son, searching his expression. He looked torn, too. Finally, she asked the woman, "How do we know you'll keep your word, that you'll stop the surveillance?" The woman gave a slight shrug. "You have no guarantee, but I can ensure that relevant files on your family are sealed. If it offers any comfort, the Valentine program has been largely dormant for years. There are only a handful of us left who manage loose ends." Her tone was matter-of-fact, as though discussing a routine business transaction. Evelyn realized this was precisely the type of person who performed cleanups for Black Ops or old clandestine projects. Matthew inhaled, turning to his mother. "If we fight, it could become a never-ending battle. If they keep tabs on us, we'll never be free. If we give in, we might spend the rest of our lives wondering if we made the right choice." Evelyn thought of Daniel's letter, of the heartbreak she felt each time she realized the scale of the lie. She also remembered the lines about how he truly cared for her despite the deception. Maybe the best way to preserve his memory was to let the fight end here. She'd uncovered the truth, and that gave her a measure of power. But exposing it might destroy any chance of closure. Slowly, she nodded. "We want an official letter stating that your organization acknowledges no further involvement with the Pierce family. And we want a final guarantee that no blacklists or hidden watch lists exist for Matthew or Karen." The woman pursed her lips, then spoke. "I can arrange a formal statement, but it will be classified in nature, not publicly recognized. Does that suffice?" Evelyn exchanged a last glance with Matthew. He nodded, resigned. "Yes," Evelyn said softly. "We'll give you the documents." Her voice trembled slightly. She couldn't believe the words were coming out of her mouth. But some part of her recognized there was no winning if they insisted on a public showdown. The woman seemed satisfied. "You've made a wise choice. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., we'll meet at the parking lot by the old library in Belhaven. Bring the materials, physical and digital. We'll finalize an agreement. Then we'll all walk away." She slid out of the booth, leaving a small slip of paper with the address. Without another word, she exited the diner. Evelyn and Matthew sat in silence for a few moments, hearts heavy. Then they paid for the untouched coffee and left. That night was filled with anxious discussion. Were they doing the right thing? Did they have a moral obligation to reveal the truth about Valentine, to stand up for all the wives who were used? Or was it more important to protect their family from further trauma? In the end, Evelyn recognized that, ironically, the best chance for a normal life was to bow out. Daniel's secrets had already cost her so much. She yearned for peace. In the morning, they gathered the files, carefully removing her father's letter and a few personal mementos. She refused to let them go. She also kept a digital copy of the letter, a private memory of Daniel. Matthew did a final check to ensure that the failsafe link holding the scanned documents was disabled. They met the woman in the library parking lot, handing over the boxes of files. In return, she gave Evelyn a sealed envelope, presumably containing the statement. They parted with no more than a curt nod. 2 days later, Evelyn visited Daniel's grave. She carried the old box from the archives, now mostly empty. She set it by the headstone. "You said I was real," she whispered, placing a gentle hand on the cold granite. "And I think somewhere in that maze of lies, you loved me too." She didn't cry, though her chest was tight with unspoken sorrow. The heartbreak she felt was profound but strangely quiet, like a wound that needed time to heal in silence. She left the box there, letting the wind tug at its edges, as if releasing her anger, her illusions, and the burdensome secrets that haunted her. She kept Daniel's final letter, folded and creased, tucked into the inside pocket of her coat. It was the one tangible piece of him she could bear to hold on to. His own words, unfiltered by any official stamp or redacted lines. She never intended to show it to anyone else. It wasn't proof of anything. It was simply her memento, a private testament that behind all the carefully orchestrated subterfuge, there was a real human heart trying to love and be loved, in spite of the shadows cast by hidden masters. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle. Karen returned home, still bruised by the truth but relieved that the matter seemed to be resolved. Matthew resumed his work, though with a new perspective on how deeply intelligence tentacles could reach. Evelyn found herself drawn to small joys, gardening in the backyard, reading novels on the porch. She met Ruth for lunch occasionally, sharing quiet commiseration. The old analyst was grateful that at least Evelyn had found some closure. The fear of being watched receded bit by bit, though Evelyn suspected that there might always be some quiet observer, some ghost of the old ways. But she sensed that the handshake deal with the woman in the diner had genuine weight. They were not the only ones who wanted to move on. The country had shifted, and that era's secrets were best left in the dusty corners of abandoned archives. For Evelyn, the real victory was reclaiming her autonomy, forging a new sense of identity untethered from the carefully choreographed illusions of the past. Some nights, she sat up in bed, running her fingers over Daniel's final letter. She read it again, hearing his voice in her mind. She forgave him bit by bit, as she realized that even he was a casualty of that clandestine system. He had found a love he never expected, and he had stayed, choosing a real bond over the mission's sterile designs. In the end, that was the only piece of him she could truly trust. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more.